Well, good morning, everybody. Good evening. This is the Whisky List chatting today to Patrick van Zuidam, who's the managing director and distiller at the Van Zuidam distillery that makes the Millstone whiskies in the Netherlands. Welcome, Patrick. Good to have you back in Australia.
Hi, David.
The first exposure that I had with Millstone was at our whiskey show in Melbourne about probably 4 or 5 years ago. So it was quite a while ago. And somebody got hold of me and dragged me to the Millstone stand and said, you've got to come and taste this rye, the Millstone 100 rye.
Yeah, one of
The
my
best,
babies.
and
Yeah.
so the Americans make rye out of the Netherlands, and it's amazing. It's got a bit of a cult following, and I think that started people getting more interested in Millstone whiskies. Then there were the Oloroso sherries, and it's really good to see the brand in Australia, and it's good to see some new products coming into the market now. But if you could please start at the beginning and the story behind the name Millstone. It's the Van Zuidam Distillery, which is your family name,
Yes.
but
Yes.
the whiskies are called Millstone. Where does that come from?
My father started the distillery, as you know, in 1975. He started this distillery. It was called Zuidam Distillers. So when I got into the distillery after my university degree, I wanted to do whiskey because that was my hang up in life. I liked whiskey. So I wanted to produce whiskey. So originally the whiskey was going to be called Lowlands whiskey, because Holland is called the Lowlands. And there's a little region in Scotland also called the Lowlands. So I thought it was funny just to call it Lowlands whiskey. But then we were sued by Mojo Concerts because they have a concert here in Holland called Lowlands. So after that, I had to find a new name for the brand. I thought Zuidam was a bit hard to pronounce for most countries outside of Holland. So I had to come up with something, and it had to be something that was connected to the distillery. It had to be also something that was connected to Holland, to the Netherlands. And then I thought, what do we do? Back then we had all the grain milled in local windmills. And I thought, something with windmills, Millstone. Oh, Millstone. Yeah, that doesn't sound half bad. So that's how it started.
Is
There
that
was a Friday. There was a Friday night, day before the introduction kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, that the whole story of the windmills that you use to mill your grain is very romantic, and it's evocative of those big windmills in across the fields. Do you still use that? Is that still a thing?
Yeah. People make fun of me these days because they say, "Oh, what a brilliant marketing scheme that you use windmills for milling the grain." But you have to keep in mind, David, that it was born out of poverty. So when I came into the distillery, we didn't have any money. But yeah, as you know, for making whiskey, you need to mill the grain. So I went to the local miller because I didn't have money to buy my own grain mill. So I went to the local miller who had a windmill in a town next to us. And I said, can you mill my grain for me? And he said, of course, but I like Geneva. So if you give me a bottle of Geneva, I'll mill your grain for you. And this is how it started. And then at some point we had 8 windmills milling our grain for us. And right now we still have 5 windmills that mill our grain. But we also have a mill in-house for the rest of the grain.
Excellent. Well, that's obviously necessity becomes the mother of invention, and it was
Yeah.
luckily they liked
Poverty
your gins as well.
creative.
But Dutch whiskey is different. We don't hear about any other whiskies coming out of Holland. Are we allowed to call it Holland still? I thought that was a.
I don't know. For me, I call it Holland, but yeah, and officially it's probably the Netherlands. I don't know. Here in Holland, we're not that difficult, are we?
um, so how does Dutch whiskey differ, if at all, from in terms of processes and styles from, say, Scotland, Ireland, even Japan, or the American whiskies?
I think you have to keep in mind that we make different kinds of whiskey. We make malt whiskey, and we make a rye whiskey or another grain whiskey. So the processes you have to keep in mind are different between the two a little bit. So for the malt whiskey, we don't mill the grain fine, we crush the grain, and the process is pretty much like it is in Scotland. Yeah, so the grain gets soaked, the grain residue gets removed from the worts. The worts get fermented and distilled twice in a pot still. Basic process. There's a few things that we do different, of course. I would say better, of course, as you understand. I would say that we do it better. The first thing is that we our worts, which is the sugary water that we drain off the grain, is completely clear. So in Scotland, most whiskey is made from a cloudy worts, as we call it. And we, instead of draining it straight away and then pumping it to the fermenter, we return it over the grain bed and we circulate that over the grain bed until it's completely clear. After that, we pump it to the fermenter and we add the yeast. So again, there we have a little difference. In Scotland, everybody uses the same yeast. It's a wonderful yeast strain called M strain. Distiller's yeast is a wonderful yeast strain. But we mix that M strain distiller's yeast with a brewer's yeast. And we do that to get more flowery and fruity flavors from the fermentation. And to ensure that we get the best out of that, we also used temperature controlled fermentation. So instead of leaving the temperature to go up, as they would in Scotland, we keep the temperature at a constant temperature during the course of fermentation, which also gives us the possibility to stretch the fermentation time to 7 days. So instead of a short, quick 48-hour fermentation, as most of my friends in Scotland do, we do a long, slow fermentation.
So what new make style does that give you? Does it make it sweeter, fruitier?
The first thing it does, because we have less stress on the yeast. So the yeast is a living organism, and it reacts to stress in its environment. And if it's stressed, it produces more side products. In this case, it produces more products like higher alcohols. So it gives a fatty, grainy note to your distiller's beer or whatever you want to call it. So because you have less stress on the yeast, you get a cleaner beer. So the beer with less grainy, fatty notes with more fruity notes. Because it's less grainy, the fruity notes come out better. And because we stretch the fermentation for a long period, like 7 days, that also means that we get a malolactic fermentation as well. So we get bacteria growing in the worts, which is not good for your yield, but it gives this nice interaction between the yeast and the bacteria, and you get these wonderful fruity flavors out of that.
And climate-wise, reading recently, there's been a cold snap in Europe with snow all over the place. But overall, over a 12-month cycle, are you pretty close to, say, Scotland, Ireland, or is it warmer?
I think we're quite a bit warmer here. Not as warm as some of my friends in India or Taiwan experience, but it's quite a bit warmer and drier than in Scotland, for example. So our average temperature is probably about 10 degrees higher than in Scotland. So that makes a difference for the maturation. In some years, like last year was a hot year, we lost, on some of the barrels, we lost 11% as an angel share. So that's, as you know, that's quite significant angel share. So yeah, it is, you have to be careful that you keep the balance within your products. So the angel share is a bit higher than in Scotland, where we usually in Scotland is between 1 and 1.5%, and we are between 6 and 9% normally.
And you talked about the yeast, but in terms of local produce, the grains, the peat, do you try and use as much local as you can, or do you just shop around for the best deals and the best quality product from anywhere in the world?
No, we are a farm distillery, so we grow by far the most of the grain that we use in the production process. We grow ourselves in town, because I think it's important to have a connection to where you're from. Whether you call it terroir or not, maybe not that important, but this way, if you grow the grain here in town, it has a connection to the place where it's distilled. So most of the grain is grown locally. Some of it I buy. For example, I haven't found a malting yet here close by that wants to do a peated malt for me. So all the peated malt that I use comes from Scotland. Mm-hmm. And for the rest, most of the grain is grown by us.
Okay. And you talked about your father starting the distillery. You must have been the most popular kids at school, you and your brother, growing up. Was there an expectation that you would end up in the family business? Did you have any other career options or paths that you thought you might follow?
Distilling is a wonderful business, and as you said, I grew up in the distillery with my brother. My parents were poor, so they had to work. They started their own distillery without much money, so you know how that is. You had to work 7 days a week, and you think child labor is something that only happens in China, but no, we grew up in the distillery. It means that after school we went to help and work in the distillery, and the same for weekends. So me and my brother grew up, surrounded by stills. I did my first distillations when I was 12 years old. But my parents always told me, this is not an easy way to make a living. And there's better ways to make a living than running a distillery, because there's always long-term planning. You have to look far ahead. Profit margins are always tight on the distilling industry. So you have to, go find yourself a real job instead of joining the family business. So I went to university. I got a master's in information management. Back in the early 90s, that meant that you had job offers lined up all over the place. But then, this business had, if you grow up in a business like this is not a business that you run because of the money. It's something that you run because of, the heart. It's something that you run with your heart more than your head, probably. So after finishing university, I thought, I'll come and join the business for a year or two, set things straight, and then I'll go for a real job. And look at me, 25 years, I'm still here. All my friends have real jobs, They have, they see this thing. There's a strange thing here in Holland that my friends have. It's days that they don't have to work and they still get paid. It's called holidays or something. Really strange concept.
Well, it's never too late, but we're very we're grateful that you we're grateful that you stuck with it. That's for sure.
It's a wonderful business. That is the thing about this business. You meet people at their best. They're happy. They are trying new things. You always meet so many nice people. We have really nice colleagues all over the world. It's a wonderful business to be in.
Yeah, no, I think nobody's going to dispute that. You talk about the challenges in certainly in running the business, but in terms of promoting Dutch whiskey both locally and around the world, any lessons you've learned or comparisons or tips that from your own experiences that you think the local Australian whiskey industry could benefit from?
I think the Australian industry is doing just fine, aren't they? As far as I hear, they are doing very well, and rightly so. They make wonderful products, so I think they deserve to do well. I think, as everywhere, I think you have to prove yourself before anything else. In the beginning, when I started selling whiskey, people were a bit skeptical because whiskey came from Scotland. Here in Holland, we drank Scotch whiskey. We didn't drink much Irish, we didn't drink much American, and certainly did not drink any Japanese whiskey. It had to come from Scotland. And it took a long time before that changed. It's probably the Japanese distillers that changed that, by making such wonderful whiskies in a country that wasn't Scotland. I think slowly they changed the perception of other countries making whiskey. And I think I profited from that. Over time you get a reputation that the products that you distill are worth drinking. From when I was a little boy, my father always told me, I was 6-7 years old when he first said it, is that in order to have an ongoing business, you need to make products that people want to drink. Selling the first bottle is almost always too much work. It's difficult. You have to connect with the consumer and sell it. But he says, to have a good business, that consumer has to go back to the shop the next day and say, God, what you sold me yesterday, that was nice. I'll have another bottle of that. And they have to tell their best friends, whoa, now I find something, stupid distillery in Holland, and they make whiskey. Would you imagine Holland whiskey? No, try it. It's good. That's what you need. You need people to do the talking for you, and that's the only way to achieve that, is to distill products that people would love to drink.
Well, we're finding that certainly in Australia that that's exactly what's happening with the Millstone whiskies. And talking about the whiskies themselves, we've got a few now that we're going to be trying in the upcoming weeks with different casks. Do you have any favorite casks that you found work for you or suit your own style and palate that for maturing your whiskies?
To be honest, my brother says I have a fetish with sherry casks. So that is my hang up probably. I love sherry casks. I love Oloroso casks for my unpeated whiskey. I like PX cask for my peated whiskey. I love sherry cask. It's such a wonderful flavor that it imparts to the whiskey. So yeah, that would be my favorite cask type. And I got lots of them. It's something that we really believe in here. Then again, just last week I released a peated whiskey from American oak, simple American oak casks, and that is actually wonderful. It's fruity. It's a little bit of a vanilla flavors from the cask. It's fruity. It's wonderful as well. So yeah, difficult to say which is your favorite cask type. Mm-hmm. But if I could pick one, I would say Oloroso.
And the rye, was it? What was the decision process to release a Dutch rye? Was that it is coming a bit out of left field. We now know it's fantastic and certainly sought after. But what made you decide to release a rye?
You have to keep in mind, David, that people grow grain that grows on the land that they have. So when we are now where the distillery is here in Holland, we had a lot of sandy soils. We're quite poor sandy soils. So on clay, you can grow any grain, but on these poor sandy soils, this is before the fertilization that we have now and the possibilities that we have now. But in the old days, a couple of 100 years ago, they grew rye here on these poor sandy soils, because rye is a grain that doesn't need much. It doesn't take much from the soil, easy to grow, winter hardy. It's a grain that was grown a lot here always. It's always played a large part in Dutch distilling. In our Genevers, we've always used a lot of rye because people used to distill what they had. People did not distill 300 years ago. People did not distill because they had they wanted to create a certain flavor as we do now. But 300 years ago, people distill whatever grain they had left over after the winter. And because probably rye was not that popular to eat, people preferred bread made from wheat to bread made from rye, probably. Though we still do rye breads here in Holland, but yeah, wheat is more popular. I think the rye was often distilled as a leftover grain. So it was people distilled what they had left over 300 years ago. So it's always been a huge part of Dutch distillation heritage, the rye. And also it has been a huge part in this area because rye used to grow here because, not now the soils are much richer, but 300 years ago, the sandy soils were perfectly suitable for rye, and not much else probably wanted to grow on these poor soils. So rye has been an intricate part of Dutch distillation and our Dutch distillation heritage. So that's why I wanted to create it. And I distill rye because I love the flavor. Nowadays, of course, you don't grow rye because it's left over. It's actually quite hard to get people to grow rye because of the regulations surrounding it. But that's why we grow it ourselves in our own fields, because it has this wonderful flavor that it gives to the whiskey. But that's now. So yeah, why do you do it? Because it's part of our heritage.
Yeah. So I always, most people probably realize that, understand that gin Geneva came from Holland in the early days, but
Yes,
not that history of the rye.
No, the rye was a big part of Dutch distillation. Yeah.
And obviously, the distillery has been going since '75, and whiskey for a long time as well. What are the oldest casks that you've got sitting in your warehouse? And are you planning any older releases, or is there a sweet spot for your whiskies that you think it's best at?
Well, personally, I think around 20, 21 years is probably a really nice age for an unpeated whiskey. If it gets older, you have to be careful that it doesn't get either too much from the cask, or it gets too much ethyl acetate from the oxidation of the whiskey in the casks. So yeah, old casks are wonderful, but you have to be keeping an eye on them, basically. Thank God, or unfortunately, never. We don't have thousands of them, so I do keep an eye on whatever we have in casks. The oldest casks of Geneva are now 30 years old, and the oldest cask of whiskey are from '96 that I have in stock.
Well, what's the oldest that you have released historically?
I think at 24, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Or it was 23, 11 months and 20 days or something.
Okay.
My brother killed me that I bottled it 10 days too early. But
no, there's I think there's one of the distillers that also used to it might have been Billy Walker, that the marketing department tore their hair out because he used to bottle it when he thought it was ready, not when they thought it would be best marketed.
Exactly. It's, for the whiskey, the 10 days or it doesn't make a difference. After it's been in the cask for 24 years, it doesn't get better after 10 extra days. But yeah, marketing people are different than production people.
And obviously, one of the reasons why we can have this chat, unfortunately, is because of COVID-19,
Yes.
and it's affected us all. And what challenges have you faced over in Europe and in the Netherlands, in terms of production, distribution, access to casks, marketing? Were you able to adapt quite quickly? What does the future hold?
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know what the future holds. I hope we get through this quickly because it's a nightmare. I think everybody. Officially we're still in a lockdown here in Holland. So bars are not open, restaurants are not open. Hairdressers are not open. So it's a disastrous situation to be in. But for the distillery, we had a good year last year. So production was uninterrupted. I had no sick people in the distillery, so all my friends that work in the distillery, they're all fine. Everybody was fine. Nobody was sick. So I think that is the most important part. Sales were good in Holland because the liquor stores were open. Sales were good in some export countries, but sales were down also in countries like Italy and Belgium and France and Germany. You see the effects of the sales on sales, of course, but it's been a very mixed view because we had countries that did 100% more, and we had countries that did maybe 30-40% less. So it's a very mixed. Overall, it balanced out pretty well. I think the distillery sales grew 30% last year. So given the situation, I think that was a pretty good achievement.
Yeah.
But the most important thing is that everybody was healthy and everybody was safe. Production went on because you know how it is with distilleries. You produce something that we're going to be bottling, not now, but we're going to produce something that we're going to be bottling 20 years from now. So if you had a huge interruption in production because of this, we would have noticed this 10 years, 20 years down the line. But yeah, no, there's no production issues. So far, we've been able to produce and we stay open. I hope with all the vaccines becoming available that we get this thing under control. I think you in Australia were much better at it than we have been in Europe.
Well, it helps being an island. That's
I know. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And optimistically, hopefully we can travel at some point. Does the distillery have a visitor center where if people do come and visit, do you have tours and presentations, etc. at the distillery?
We're not open for the public as such, but if you come over from Australia, just send me an email and then we'll make some time for you to show you around the distillery. But it's not open for the general public as such.
Well, definitely on my list. And when you aren't drinking Millstone, Patrick, what whiskies do you drink? Or
well, we have so many wonderful colleagues all over the world, of course. But I like Old Macallans. I know most people like Old Macallans, but I like Old Macallans. I love the Balvenie 1401 things that they did a couple of years ago. Those were pretty decent. And I do love Japanese whiskey. I have to say they are very good at balancing, and I think balance is really important in whiskey. And I think the Japanese are masters in creating that balance in products. So yeah, wide area of things. I like the things that Dan is doing for the Cotswolds distillery. I like the things that they do in India with Amrut. So yeah, lots of different friends that do lots of different wonderful products.
And when you can travel again, what country or countries would be top of your list to visit?
Outside of Europe, I think I would love to come to Australia because it's been in my wish list for decades, but it's a bit far. You should have made it closer to Europe. Maybe you can pick it up and bring it closer. No, and Australia and Japan are things that I would love to see. See some colleagues in Japan and Australia to see how they do things. Maybe to get some new insights and production methods and ideas for the future. You never know.
Well, it's not that far from Japan to Australia, so you can just arrange a
so
road trip.
combine it. Yeah, I have to combine it.
Definitely.
Make a trip out of it.
Well, Patrick, it was wonderful chatting to you, and we really look forward to joining you again when you talk about the 6 specific whiskies that we kind of been presenting to our whiskey-loving colleagues and friends in Australia. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.